probably have already chatted with since he's been with us, but Niall is Assistant Professor of Art History, where he teaches the architecture and urbanism of late medieval and Renaissance Italy. His research is focused on the relationship between sound, space, and architecture, and their role in the construction of pre-modern urban societies. In his current research, he is exploring ways of visualizing his work on early modern urban soundscapes. And he's embarking on a project focused on spatial disorientation in the accounts of Italian travelers and its relationship to the experience and symbolic meaning of urban environments in pre-modern Europe. Niall's recent publications include The Noisy Renaissance, Sound, Architecture, and Florentine Urban Life, and an article titled Thinking Through Noise, Building Towards Silence, Creating a Sound Mind in Sound Architecture in the Pre-Modern City. Niall will be speaking to us today on a topic he calls Solvitur Ambulando, Walking, Seeing, Understanding. Let's welcome Niall.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you. It's very much an honor to be here. And what I want to talk to you about this morning is a project that I'm embarking on. So I have in no means have worked out all of the, even the questions, let alone the answers to this project. But I want to show you the kinds of things that I'm using as source material in my interest ultimately in the experience of the city by the walking body, and in the pre-modern city, where walking I'm understanding as a form of knowledge production and cognition. And in this, what I'm going to talk to you about today primarily are different ways in which, and I have to admit these are all Florentines. I apologize for that. I'm trying to get out of the Florentine ghetto. It's very, very difficult because there's a lot of stuff in there. But they're all Florentines, but there are moments in which they are trying to understand the city around them in different contexts and the methods. I'm trying to distill the kinds of methods that they are using. And so let me begin right away and first introduce you to Giovanni Villani, who writes a chronicle of Florence in the 14th century, and it's a very, very important text for us in understanding the medieval history of the city. And he's a merchant. And in this chronicle, he steps out of the historical narrative and he takes the reader on a walk around the city walls, which he served on the board of the trustees who were organizing the construction of the new walls that were finished around 1333. So they're brand new. He's very proud of them. So he takes us on a kind of imaginary walk, and as he goes along, he mentions every single tower and its height. He measures the distance between each tower, and then he names the gates and how tall they are. And he continues like that around the entire city, counting by Florentine braccia. And Florentine braccia are a measurement of your forearm. It's about 0.58 meters. And so this will come up a lot because the braccia becomes a kind of this universal standard of measuring and quantifying the world. So he walks around and he talks about every individual feature. And after that, he comes into the city, and we follow him through the main axes that go through the center of the city, and he measures them as well. And you can see, if you can see the numbers, you can see the ways in which he imagines that this cross, this axis of the city, is pretty geometrically harmonious in terms of its measurement. And he talks about being a perfect cross, even though it isn't a perfect cross. And then what he does later in his chronicle is he discusses Florence again, but this time it's not about walls, gates, right, and measurements. It's about counting all of the things that the city produces, and he brings together things like how many mouths that needed to be filled. How many ovens there were in the city. He talks about how many children, or boys and girls, are being educated at various different levels in the public education system. Baptisms, you can see how he counts convents, abbeys, parishes, churches, cattle, vats of wine that are produced and consumed in the city, how many melons come into the city that year. He always has access to the gate tax records as well as, and so in this, he builds up this city. I'm calling it a machine for living, which of course is I stole this from Le Corbusier, the architect who imagined his domestic architecture as a machine for living. But the way in which he understands the city as both an architectural static phenomenon, as well as a kind of a system of relationships, an economy that includes education, salvation, as well as food, and showing the relationship between the city, its future, its past, and its actually the outlying region that provisions it as well. And so I'm taking these two modes of describing the city as models that Florentines use, because most literate Florentines would have read this chronicle, as well as widely distributed, as models for the ways in which they then adapt themselves to their city and come to know their city, describe their city for themselves, for their families, for others, and they also do it, if I get to it at the end, when they go traveling to foreign places as well. And so I'm thinking about the city in terms of its representation, therefore, between two poles. And this showing, this is Ghirlandaio's fresco of the handing of the rule to St. Francis as if it took place in Florence in its central square. We have a relatively faithful description of the square in the back and a completely then fictitious scene happening in it, because this happened in Rome, not in Florence. But I want to sort of juxtapose the ways in which the city is imagined as a series of official, civic, ritualized representations that express the body politic, as well as, if you go to the background of this image, where you see the kind of the dated and the informal networks of more casual sociability happening in the same spaces that is represented by this painting. So so the first Florentine merchant I want to talk about has no name, but he writes a chronicle, an anonymous chronicle, in around 1381. He's describing political events in the city, and in order to understand what's going on in real time, since there's no such thing as mass media of any form, he has to be out in the street listening to what's going on constantly. And so throughout this chronicle, he says things like, "It is said throughout Florence," or "People are saying in Florence," or "This is the word on the street." And what he's trying to figure out is what's happening politically in a city that is going through, at this moment, constant turmoil. So in order to understand how that turmoil is working itself out, he describes a series of events, and I'm using this as a way to show the kind of hierarchy of spaces that would have been understood by Florentines. So he talks about how, on the far right of the screen, at the Piazza Sant'Ambrogio, there are whole masses of workers massing, and that's giving a great deal of anxiety to the authorities, because the workers several years before had taken over the city, had taken over the government, and so they are assembling in a peripheral zone. So immediately what happens is the elites in that neighborhood gather at the Piazza Santa Croce, and they assemble on their horses. And then what happens, he describes how in the central square, the Piazza della Signoria, they're handing out the flags of the various districts to the militias. And so what he's reading there is that, okay, the lower classes are amassing in the periphery. Immediately, the elites of that neighborhood gather in the neighborhood's main square, and then the government, the central government, hands out the authority to go and hunt them down. And you that series of, from periphery to the center of the neighborhood to the center of the city, that kind of really an exchange of hierarchies are being reinforced at a moment when they are threatened. And so this is a way in which he understands what is about to happen, or anticipates what's happening politically. And then he talks about how the great merchants of the city amass at Mercato Nuovo, the new market, which is the site of international banking and finance. So it represents the economic space of the city's elites. So all of a sudden, all of the major squares are being sort of reinforced with the presence and symbolism of those who believe they had legitimacy to occupy them in order to counter this peripheral menace. And what they do for the Mercato Nuovo is they don't go and immediately engage with the workers right away. What they do is they first go and destroy their corporate headquarters, the headquarters of their guild, in order to destroy their tools, their statutes, and their coats of arms. And in fact, their coats of arms were, sorry, here, let me show you. There's the Mercato Nuovo there. So that's where they would have, the banking elite would have assembled. Here is the place where It's called the Mercanzia. It's the merchant tribunal. All of the, right here, along there, all of the city's guilds had their arms sculpted on the side of this building, and it probably dates to the 14th century. So what they did is immediately would go to their headquarters of this working class guild, and then they destroyed or defaced their coats of arms from this building. So before they engaged with them physically, they destroyed the center, all the things that legitimize them as a corporate body, right? So statues, the texts that incorporate them, the coats of arms that represent them, and their headquarters where they gathered. And here's just a picture from the 14th century from an illustrated version of Villani's Chronicle, where you see the Florentines assembling as the popolo, as the people of Florence, with their own coats of arms and flags, which they used to counter the coats of arms and flags of the lower guilds. And on the crossed flag represents the people of Florence, and the lily, the fleur-de-lis, represents the city itself. And so those two symbols stand in for who gets to represent the city. So this is a way in which he's constantly reading politics by the changing visual semiotics of the city, as he sees things happening in particular places, and he sees the movement of certain symbols that designate certain groups. The next merchant I want to mention is Paolo da Certaldo. He writes a book called The Book of Good Customs, or Good Behavior, more or less. It's kind of a moralizing treatise for his family. And he, as a businessman, is extremely interested in keeping secrets. And this is something that is very important in a world where all communication is primarily most communication is face-to-face, as business dealings are conducted face-to-face. And with Florentine merchants, many of whom are engaged in long-distance trade, have to have, as businessmen today have to also have, is access to the most up-to-date information, be that political, foreign political events, environmental catastrophes, and that kind of thing. So getting word about what's happening in the world helps in your ability to make profit, right, when you're engaged in long-distance trade throughout the Mediterranean. And what you want to do is also keep as much of that information secret for your own personal and benefit, and the benefit of your firm. And so he talks about, okay, you've got to keep secrets. So whenever you're walking through Florence, always make sure, if you're talking business to people, that no one's hiding around the corner trying to listen behind a hedge or a wall. Because when you enter into a room, always check behind the curtains to make sure someone's not hiding behind there that can listen to what you're saying. And make sure you know everybody in the room to make sure they're all friends. And so he's giving business advice. So it tells us that he understands that once you begin speaking in public space, the words you have that you let out are let loose into a kind of a public conversation which you no longer have rights over them. And so keeping secrets is the point. And so he says you have to speak your secrets behind a very thick wall. So in other words, the ideal architecture for a merchant, all right, is a kind of inner sanctum where no sound can get out. But he also recognizes that architecture always springs leaks, and architecture always has to have thresholds to get in and out. And so he says, in that case, sometimes it's even better to just go out into the middle of the square and speak in the middle of the open city. And this is the place where everyone, the Piazza della Signoria is where everyone in Florence went to find out the latest news. So paradoxically, he says, although there are no walls to protect you, you will be able to see all around you. No one can hide from your vision, and you'll be able to know who is within hearing distance of your conversation and who's not. And you can create what my colleague who works in Venice has called these kinds of acoustic cocoons, the ways in which you can create a kind of a bodily architecture in the square and talk amongst yourselves secretly while surveilling the competing landscape around you. And here, okay, this is Giovanni Morelli, another contemporary. All these merchants are born in the 14th century, and they die in the early 15th century. So Giovanni Morelli has a very different idea in his book that he writes to his family. And he is he's very, very worried about being deceived by others. And so for him, walking through the city and engaging with people is an art of deception always. You have to construct a persona that's public, that people can't penetrate, and that you're completely in control of. And so, because you always have to create a viable public reputation, something that's called publica fama, and in medieval law is basically your reputation. Your reputation is established by listening to what people say about you on the street. So in other words, your identity is a kind of negotiation between the kind of persona you try to construct, but it's also mediated by how much the public decides to allow you to have that or produces for you. So it's a constant negotiation, the ways in which your identity is embedded in public space and in that dialogue. And so he says, when you are interested in courting a girl, then go to her neighborhood after your shop is closed, with friends, not alone, and just make yourself present in the neighborhood and get people talking about you as if you're a virtuous kind of person because they see you acting in a proper way. And that'll establish your reputation before you're actually able to make contact with her family and ultimately with her. He says, always have, on a hot day, always have a cool glass of wine ready for anyone who might stop by in order to, to produce a certain kind of hospitality and amicability, but it's all for him a show. Because for him, as one historian has said, Giovanni imagines the city as a kind of nightmarish menace bent on his personal destruction, so that he says to his family, never talk badly about anyone else. If someone's talking badly about the government, which is a crime in Florence, just pretend you're not listening. And construct this kind of veneer of personal sort of amicability and gullibility, and never sort of give away what you're really thinking. So Giovanni and Paolo are sort of two I think paragons of the ways in which merchants are trying to negotiate a city that is very, very difficult to do in terms of controlling how information is used and how it's dispersed in urban space. Okay. That brings me to Benedetto Day. This is for Nora. Benedetto Day is a fascinating merchant. He's about a century later in quite a different city, a city that is a little less tumultuous in terms of its politics, because the Medici family have infiltrated Republican institutions and are beginning to bend those institutions towards their own personal will and profit. And so Benedetto thrives because he is a kind of creature of the Medici, or a partisan of the Medici. In any case, his diary is full of lists of things, and he's very much a Florentine propagandist as well. So in one of his endless lists, he starts off each line, and I'm showing you this, the ways in which the manuscript is set up. He has in red ink, he'll start the line, and that red ink starts every sentence the same way. This is not literature, this is just list making. So he says Florentia Bella, right? So beautiful Florence. And he talks about how it is the way in which it is better than the way Venetians and Genovese do things. He talks about the amount of tax income and the amount of public expenditures every year as well. He talks, and so he's counting numbers in terms of these taxes as well. And he talks about how many palaces are outside the city, up to 5 miles. So he's talking about the richness and abundance of a city that is extremely wealthy, and he wants to show how that abundance is measured. And he's doing a similar thing to the way in which Villani, a century earlier, who he read, it's clear because he quoted him at several points, understands the city, right, as an abundant money and thing-producing mechanism. And he also says in one of these lines, Florentia Bella, it's hypnotizing to read this diary, because the entire thing is like this. Florentia Bella, he says there are 50 squares inside the city, and on every square there's a church, and there are palaces, and there are houses all around, and the principal citizens of the ruling class live there, and it's full of merchants and workshops and everything you need. And then he starts. Prima piazza, first piazza, and he goes through every single one, and he talks about the ways in which maybe what kinds of activities happen there, what maybe festivals take place there, and maybe some interesting buildings that are there. He goes through, he lists about 40. He says there are 50, but he lists 40. He might have got tired at some point. And he talks about, in this square, the Santa Croce, this is the Franciscan church. This is one of the main squares of the city. Just give you an image from the 16th century, the kind of lively public culture that he's describing there. He talks about people throwing and kicking balls against the wall for as games. He talks about jousts. He talks about buying and selling. He talks about women cleaning and doing laundry and that kind of thing. Just it's kind of the tumultuous everyday public life. Here's another list, and this is a list of his own neighborhood, which he starts off with saying una via, right, a street, and goes on and on and on and on. And so what he does, so for example, in this case, he says, let's see if it works here. Una via, okay, from the gate of San Frediano to the gate of San Nicolo is full of gentlemen. And he says, from the Ponte Vecchio up into the gate of San Piero Gattolino, which is all, the gate that goes to Rome. From the bridge of Santa Trinita up until the column on Via Maggio. From the bridge at Carraia up until the gate of the furnaces, or they have the kilns, also the gate that goes to Rome. I'm not going to go through every single one, but from the bridge, from the Ponte Vecchio up until the port of San Giorgio, the gate of San Giorgio, that goes into the neighborhood of Arcetri. I want to give you just a sense of the kind of, it becomes poetic in a way. At first it's extremely annoying, but after a while it becomes quite poetic. And he goes through every single street, all 27 streets in his neighborhood from end to end, and he counts 11,000 braccia. So he's literally walked through every damn street, counting and measuring at the same time, which are what Florentine merchants are always doing, because in practice, when they're buying and selling, they have to be extremely good at estimating weights, volumes, measures, and distances, because they're constantly buying and selling in a culture in which every single city had different weights and measures standards. And so they have to be have a complex understanding of space that way. And so that's his neighborhood. And the thing is, it's not, in a way, it's not just a listing of things for to quantify it. So here, una via. Aldorato Pitti is a fellow. He lives underneath Caponi up until the Marsili family in the Borgo San Jacopo. And then, so that's one of the streets. So those are not just names of people, those are names of his friends. And so this is a kind of a mental geography that he's constructing through these lists, because he also has a list of enemies. And you can see that the same names often are on both lists, which means different branches or different members of those families are enemies. He says they're cordial enemies, so they're not necessarily he gives him a sense of the city as these sort of local hotspots of places he's always going to be welcome, and places where he may not be completely welcome. But it's certainly places where he knows he can get a cool glass of wine, or a place where something might be thrown at him. And so, so these lists have a kind of social topography built into them that are the results of walking through the city. He then describes the Church of Santa Croce, the Franciscan church. And he starts off by counting the steps up to the facade. Then he measures the width of the facade. He goes into the church, measures the entire length of the nave. He then measures the crossing arms up here. Then he counts the altars, the chapels, the reliquaries, and then he passes into the chapter house, into the first cloister, the second cloister, all the way, noting things like where the wells are, how many friars are living there. Actually, I've got a list of this. So here's some of the things that he, after all his measurements. Okay, 9 flagellum encompass 8 wells, 1 refectory, 1 chapel, has 2 cloisters, a beautiful garden, a barber shop, apothecary, salt stores, kitchens, a magnificent library of Greek, Arabic, Chaldean, Turkish, Latin, and Italian texts, which are envied by all the friars in Venice, Milan, Siena, and Naples. So this is part of his propaganda, but it's also about the ways in which he's completely invested in both the architectural space, but also that he sets up, that he then fills, right, with its human, right, and infrastructural content that has meaning for him in terms of its prestige, but also the amount of learning going on. So for him as a merchant, the amount of learning going on is directly proportional to the amount of books and the amount of languages, as opposed to kind of a qualitative understanding of what actual. He trusts that they're doing proper work in there, in any case, in terms of intellectual culture. This is a possible portrait of him from the apse of the Dominican Church in Florence. And there is an image of Bellini's image of Mehmet II. Because Benedetto Dei, although he's completely obsessed with his own neighborhood and his own city, he travels a great deal. And imagines he claims to have traveled to Timbuktu, places in Asia, almost as far as India. There's evidence that he did go to many places, and he created contacts everywhere. He then claims that he was having a conversation with the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan, who at the time he met him was in Bosnia, and he was contemplating the view across the Adriatic to see, well, what's next, right, on the dinner menu for the Sultan as he's marching through Europe at this point. And he tells Benedetto Dei, I'm going to go and I'm going to crush Italy. I'm just going to go and take it. And Benedetto says no, and this is why, because now here is the way in which he expands his description of his neighborhood, of a church, of a city, into the Italian peninsula. He says, well, no, because Italy is made up of 4 independent nations, right? The Florentines, the Venetians, the Duke of Milan, and the King of Naples. That's how it's divided up right now. And within that structure, he says, there are 16 independent secondary cities. And he names them all to the Sultan. And on top of that, or is there on top of that? Let's see if there is. I don't know, there may not be. But he says, although the Sultan responds to him by saying, well, you know what? All of these warring little factions you have I'm just going to walk in and crush you, right? And show you how insignificant your rivalries are between all of these independent cities. As you know, Italy was, at this time, was broken up into very fiercely independent city-states who were on the verge of becoming duchies and being sort of absorbed into larger states. And he says, you know, all of this, while you're all fighting, I'm just going to walk in with my troops, I'm going to take you all over. And he says, no, because as soon as anyone who's foreign, right, so he's establishing a difference between what are Italians, yeah? As soon as anyone foreign enters onto Italian soil, as he understands it, they all magically unite into one giant fighting force that is even more powerful than ancient Rome, because no one can come and invade us, because we've got 1,750 miles of coastline, he says. I don't know how he knows that, and then all of which is fortified. And not only that, all of our allies in Europe are going to come to defend us because we've married our Florentine daughters to all of these ruling houses of Europe. That's the defense plan. Okay. Then he scales up in another part of his diary, and he says, this is Europe. Benedetto Dei's Europe is filled with, well, it starts at the edge of, just beyond the Crimea there, and he names in this order all of the what he believes are the European territories, as he understands them. And then at the end, he finds Italy, and inside Italy, you see it coming from the second door view. Inside Italy, you have Italia Bella, right? It's the most beautiful jewel within this. And he names, again, all of the different territories inside it. And then he can't help it. He says, and there's bread, and there are arms, and there's wine, and there are merchants, and so much wealth. So when he quantifies and names and lists territories, always at the end, he stuffs it full with stuff, like either things, people, or certain kinds of cultural production. So he's constantly understanding the world in terms of Villani's categories, I think. Okay. Now I want to exit Florence and just briefly talk about the 3 amigos who go to the Holy Land together with their friends, and these 3 write they write a travel log of their adventures in 1384 and 85. And they go on foot from Florence to Venice, and then there they get on a ship and they sail to the Holy Land. This is their route. Their route out, they want to go in chronological order. So they want to go to Egypt first, because they want to visit Old Testament sites first, and then merge into the New Testament, culminating with a visit to Jerusalem, for example. So they go to Alexandria first, and they make their way up the canals, one of the canals of the Nile, and make it down to Cairo. And then they walk, basically, through the Sinai, back up to the Holy Land here, to Damascus, and then they leave from Beirut and they sail back. And the reason that this line is here is because they hit a storm here and they end up at the Barbary coast over here. They're on a ship that doesn't have any oars. Okay, so here is, now, what they are doing also is they are going backwards along the itinerary of the most famous travel guide to the Holy Land from Italy that was produced in the 1350s by a guy called Niccolo da Poggibonsi, and this is an illustrated version from the Archives of Florence I'm showing you here, which is a picture of Cairo. Poggibonsi imagined that you went first to the Holy Land and then down through Egypt and then back to Italy, but they went backwards. And it's probable or likely that they were carrying a version of his book with them. But what I'm showing you here, these three guys, all of them, when they get to Cairo, they obviously are walking around the city and then through it to figure out how big it is. Because they all give the dimensions of the city, and they're all different. And Babylon is the Coptic Christian part, which is why they care about that. So yeah, so 18 by 8 miles, 5 by 10. Gucci said a total agglomeration of 16 by 8, or 12 miles long by 30 miles in circumference. So they're walking around walls and walking through streets. And they talk about promenading in the city as one of the things they first do. They first get a spatial sense of the city before they start talking about their other experiences in the city. When they go to the pyramids, which then were thought to be the granaries of the Pharaoh, where they stored the wheat when Joseph told them that they were going to have famine, they are smart enough as merchants to figure out that these things could not hold wheat because they're not empty, right? These things are full of stone, which they say. But they also measure. They say, you know, each side of this pyramid is 380 braccia, and it's 1 bow shot high.
Yeah.
So for things they can't actually walk around, the bow shot is a way of measuring space as well. And he says they walked around it. He says explicitly, we walked around it with like some kind of measuring stick to figure out that it's half a mile in circumference. And this is how they get a sense of what the world is like compared to their own world. Because when they get to a place like Damascus, they immediately walk around its walls, and they are completely, the word is, awed by, overwhelmed by, and in total fascination of Damascus. Because, as they say, let's see if do I have this here? Let's see. Because of the massive scale on which things are happening there that they've never seen before, and it's a tricky thing for a Florentine in particular, but Italian in general, a Florentine merchant, to admit, right, that there's a city that is 3 times larger than Florence, that whose trade in goods is many times larger, and that there are more people in this city than all of Tuscany, and it completely freaks them out. And when they're measuring the walls, I'm showing you here some of the reconstructed ancient walls of Constantinople, Istanbul, which are built in a similar double circuit. They say, okay, 3 times as large as Florence, double wall system, well built, and of good stone. So they're appraising the stone as well. Inner walls measured 30 braccia, 3 times the height of Florence. Many round towers set 25 braccia intervals. So they're doing exactly the same thing as Milani is. They're walking around and measuring the distance between, the distances vertically. Outer walls were 20 braccia high with a similar circuit of towers, a great moat which was 16 braccia wide. Inside there was a citadel, a mile in circumference, that could hold 20,000 men-at-arms. This just sets up this, the kind of economic abundance that Damascus as a trading city was producing, and they're so amazed. So once they get the spatial description perimeter, and then they begin talking about the streets. They actually have trouble, in a way, describing the streets because there's so many people on them, they can't measure them properly. And they've never seen so many people, and they've never seen so many workshops with so orderly, they say, and so many finely crafted goods, and everything on sale from like the lowliest little thimble, right, to the most expensive silk. So that they know that a lot of this stuff is coming, right, from along the Silk Road, for example, and the great trading centers through Central Asia. And they also know that a lot of the stuff they end up with in Florence is coming through places like Damascus, and that Damascus is the big entrepot, and that they are somehow suddenly a secondary trading city, and it's awe-inspiring to them. And then they start talking culturally. So they mention things like they have these, what I would call pop-up restaurants. They're men carrying tables on their heads. On top of the table is a pot boiling on an open flame with all the utensils and things needed for a meal. And they watched as these, right in the middle of the street, off the person would take the table off their head, put it down in the street, and a whole family would sit around the table, and the person would start cooking for them right there in the street. And even to this day, Italians generally, Florentines in particular, eating on the street is just something they can't get their heads around. And so this completely fascinates this, right? This sort of instant fast food that they see, and the efficiency with which it's produced is absolutely amazing. And so Damascus becomes, in a way, well, they actually say it. He says, Giorgio Gucci says, if I have a quote from him, and to say Damascus, the word Damascus for them, for the Muslims, is like saying what Paris is for us. So it's like the cultural, right, royal capital in a way that is only comparable to a city like Paris for them. And then he goes to the Sinai. And what I'm showing you here is just a little visualization of his mind. Frescobaldi, when they're down in the southern Sinai at the monastery of St. Catherine, and from there you climb several hundred steps up to the top of the mountain where Moses supposedly received the tables of the law. And while his friends are trying to chip off pieces of that rock as souvenirs, he turns around, he looks out over the desert, and he looks at the Red Sea, he sees the red color of the sand, and it immediately reminds him of cinnabar, which is a product he knows that they import in Florence, right, as a dyeing product, for the partly for the red robes that the Florentine government counselors wore, which is extremely important in terms of its symbology. And he understands, he sees the trade routes. So he's at a place which is crucial to his cultural formation as a pilgrim. And but what really gets him excited is the fact that he can see the larger trading routes across this vast world that end up, right, at Mediterranean ports and cities like Florence of one product like cinnabar. And so to conclude, I just want to read a short conclusion just to sum up some of the ideas I'm thinking about. These Florentine merchants in the 14th and 15th centuries, therefore, attempted to take account of cities as a means to construct meaningful itineraries through spaces that were heterogeneous by nature. In taking account of the social dynamics surrounding them, they documented the different ways of negotiating cities that were simultaneously familiar and foreign, both in terms of their local neighborhoods versus others, and even foreign cities. So these descriptions of places, streets, religious itineraries, lists of friends and enemies, chronologies of events, measured streets, numbered squares, wealthy houses, strange customs, they recreate through textual juxtaposition the manner in which urban spaces were actually experienced as this heterogloss, this kind of simultaneous experience of completely unrelated things that they try to quantify into manageable narratives. And as one moved through the city, one encountered a variety of irreconcilable viewpoints that were always inflected by both by one's social and spatial position. And all of this was the result of measuring urban space against a walking body. Such careful scrutiny was necessary when encountering the social and architectural facades of people and buildings. So I think this is important to me for our historians, perhaps less for others, but because we are constantly interpreting pictures and iconographies and architectural facades, Florentines are doing the same thing, but they're using the same techniques to interpret what people do and what they look like, as well as what buildings do and what buildings look like. And so the architectural facades of people and buildings were always had to be decoded, interpreted, quantified, and set in relation to each other. The image we get is of everyday spaces of the city is not one of a free exchange of ideas. These texts do not depict a transparent, coherent picture of urban life. These city spaces were highly contested, fluid in meaning, unstable from one moment to the next. Cities were not unified wholes, but an endless series of both random and staged encounters, connections and possibilities that had to be constantly accounted for, anticipated, or circumscribed. These merchants had to find ways to negotiate through competing interests, to carve out meaningful topographies that allowed each of them in some way, at home or abroad, to access and participate in the construction of urban space. And that's really what I'm trying to get at, is that these modes of walking and stitching together narratives and describing, for me, is a form of urbanism that I think is very much connected to issues of walkability that we talked about yesterday. Thank you very much.
We've got plenty of time.
Yes, Emily.
Neil, your photo or your map that had the neighborhood where the gentleman lived and traced all his steps. How well defined are neighborhoods in Florence at that time, and would he have had a sense that this is my neighborhood? Yeah, that one. Yeah, I see you have the different colors there. What do those mean?
Oh, right, yeah. This is part of a map I'm actually working on, because the political jurisdictions in a city like Florence are absolutely codified for taxation purposes, especially, and for voting purposes, and for representation on various city councils. So you have the city divided into four districts, 4 quarters, sorry, and then each quarter is divided into 4 districts or wards. And so what I'm showing you here actually is a succession of expansion of city walls by the colors here, the different color scheme for the wards, but the original Roman castrum in Byzantine city versus the expansion in the 11th century, and then Milanese expansion in the 14th century there. And so those are definite neighborhoods and are imposed from above. And what I find interesting is that what I've tried to work on, recently, I'm continuing to work on in building the soundscapes. And this, you'll know, Elizabeth, from that article, that chapter that you read, that parishes are a completely different spatial entity. That's my argument at the moment. Because politics is fixed from on high, the parish is unfixed from below. I'm constantly trying to figure out ways in which I can bring together forms of urbanism that are programmatic and from governments and are based on the certain interests of power elites, versus the everyday lives of people. They're trying to organize their world to suit, their spatial world to suit themselves. And one of them, I think, is the parish, because although you do pay a parish tax to be buried in that parish or to belong, it seems that you can belong to pretty much any parish you want. And so when I tried to draw the map of the parishes based on self-identification of a census from the 16th century, I found that it looked like a series of gerrymandered Texas voting districts, it doesn't make any sense. Some were non-contiguous, and often the churches didn't belong inside the territories where the parishioners lived. And so, since even the experts on Florentine church history can't agree on the number of parishes at any given time, I make the case that the parishes come into being as a spatial entity during civic festivals, when parish bells are ringing as processions are passing by them, and there is a situation where you have cathedral ringing and then parish bells ringing as a procession passes, and processions singing to the saints of the churches as they pass by. So that my imagination is that acoustically, what you heard is the parishes coming into being as a series of acoustic markers in relation to each other that don't have fixed spatial boundaries because of the nature of sound, but have boundaries in terms of identity, that you would know what your parish sounded like when you're in it and when you're not in it. Because my idea, and we'll see if this proves true when I build the sonic map about trying to create an acoustic map in which you can actually model the relationship between sounds and placing listeners in different parts of the city to see what kind of echolocation is possible.
So no relationship between that parish definition, discontiguous as it is, and these political...
Not at all, none,
Huh.
practically none. I mean, in a couple of cases it's almost close, but no, the parish is much smaller, and so when people talk about where they're from, like Benedetto says, I'm a Florentine, I live in the quarter of Santo Spirito, in the district of Ferza, and I live in this parish. There are whole levels of places where you live you can be identified by. Yeah. So
I just had a question. I was fascinated by the lists in which the lists of people become commodified because, well, they're interjected with the list of things that can be bought and sold. And I was curious if you found moments of discomfort, like or moments where the lists seem to suggest unease with the ways in which people, or with the kind of the merchant's task of weighing and appraising the worth of everyone and everything, and particularly I was thinking about that in relationship to the pilgrimage to these holy sites, and if there's any kind of tension between the appraisal, the act of kind of appraising a space versus a spiritual mission, which would see where one, I don't know, I guess have an appraisal of the spirit or something.
Yeah. I think in the case of the Florentine travelers in the late 1300s, they seem quite impressed with the biblical topography, but it's a bit tricky because the Franciscans are in control of all Western Franks, they call them, Western Christians when they visit the Holy Land. And so you have a minder with you. And so when you read enough of these travel logs, you realize they're being fed the same stories from the same guides, the same myths. And so there's a kind of, and I mean, this is something that I can maybe make a comparison to the ways in which Florence is often experienced by tourists today, right? The same stories by the same people, the same myths are being perpetrated over and over, right, in mass tourism. And there's a hint of that in the Holy Land, and so when you get to a place like Jerusalem, it's difficult to parse out what they're actually experiencing in terms of their affective relationship to the city, to their Christian salvation and whatnot. These guys in the 14th century seem pretty happy, and they marvel at things like, and the Muslims consider this a holy site too. But then it's kind of a bummer because it means that Christians don't have full access to it at all times because it's a holy site also to Muslims. And they, but like when they go to the River Jordan, the River Jordan is kind of dirty. It's not particularly a nice river, although they make themselves baptize themselves in it. There's a kind of overall disappointment with the unspectacularity and an attempt, I think, to be amazed. I mean, they do. What happens in one case? One person I didn't talk about. He's with the group, and he doesn't like it so much. So he actually waits until because going to the Holy Land from the 14th and 15th century is basically a package tour you buy in Venice. It's all prepaid. The meals are prepaid, and you get 2 weeks to run around with guides, and then you're back on the boat. So he purposely misses his boat so he can go and visit the Holy Sepulchre on his own. You have to get permission and keys, and so that's all set up for you by the travel agency. But if you can finally get in by yourself, because you get locked in there at night as a Christian once you're on the inn, and there he has a real meaningful experience because he's alone and he's away from that tour guide stuff. So, but Damascus, you get very genuine reactions. But because I didn't talk about this, but it's also where Cain killed Abel, according to Christian mythology, and there's a place where Paul escaped from, I think. So that means something to them as well. But when they climb the mountain where Christ spent 40 days or nights, I mean, these guys, one of them on the way down gets robbed by someone, and so it's kind of a drag. And traveling is really, really arduous, and there's lots of. One of the three friends who goes keeps in his book at the end of his account, he lists all of the fees they had to pay, which for for gating transport, for permission to transport barrels of wine across Muslim territory, getting into cities, into Christian monuments, who you had to pay and how much. It lists it for the benefit of others going. So no, you have to bring money with you. And he talks about how he was in charge of the money, and he had a certain amount of florins in one pouch, and then he had an inner pouch inside where he had more money for, for security purposes. So, to answer your question, they're a lot less excited than you might imagine, in a way. I think that's why I think he turns around when he's up, you know, in the mosaic topography. Turns around. He's more fascinated by looking at the Red Sea than he is at thinking about the Ten Commandments. Yes.
You know, on the one hand, there's sort of an impression of fortification that's been made when Benedict Levay tells Mehmet II that, oh, look, it's going to be really hard for you to actually invade, and it's going to be really hard for you to do this because look at all of this information that I can give you about how impossible it's going to be for you to make a successful incursion into this place. And the first merchant that he discussed, who was doing this walking tour of Florence, with the fortifications there as well, in terms of how many branches from one to the other, but also how the thickness of the walls and so on, also could convey that impression of, once again, that stability and strength in fortification, which is countermanded by the impression, and this may be true, the impression of the kind of deep anxiety that is betrayed by the incessant cataloguing and mapping out of not only the contours of the city, but also who lives where, who are your friends, who are your enemies, and so on and so forth, right? And so your use of, I think towards the end you talked about the kind of charting of itineraries, made me wonder how many of the merchants in Florence, or to what extent was the trade that was present in Florence, the trade and commerce in Florence, also through itineraries? Because it is said, the kind of that anonymous merchant, right, the rumor, that's very dangerous, right? Because you don't know where the stories are circulating from and who's perpetuating these stories. So it is said, but also hang on, be careful where you talk because someone might be hiding behind the hedge. There's always this fear of those trade secrets or whatever business secrets that are being given away. So in thinking about how the merchants you're looking at from Florence went outside and were also in conversation with people elsewhere in Damascus and Egypt and so on, to what extent was there presence of the outsiders but also itinerants in Florence at this time?
Quite important, both culturally and economically. There are peasants enter the city every day, in particular men and women, selling particular kinds of things, as well as elite sort of bankers and traders are meeting traveling merchants as well. And that's where a lot of the information about the outside world comes from. And I think that in terms of anxiety, I think there is a certain anxiety about like when you were. I was thinking this, and so I thank you for your creating that dialectic between this description of what should be a well-fortified, impenetrable city, and the idea that it's constantly being penetrated and has to be in a way because things have to come in and out all the time. And so regulating the, I think the business of architecture is to regulate the coming in and the coming out. And that's how they understand it, that they have this massive system you can't control, and the walls are part of the mechanism that helps to filter in and out things that can come in or should come in, and things that shouldn't come in. And so there is a great deal of international, at the elite level, international exchange that way. Is that you're talking about the presence of foreigners in the city? Absolutely. And I think it's, and there are certain classes of foreigners too, because I mean, Florentines will understand their relationship to other Italian cities in more antagonistic terms than they will foreigners from further away, who are less of a threat to them because they're much more opportunity as opposed to competition, for example. So you get certain hierarchies like that as well. But at the level of the peasants, at the lower level, it's clear that they belong there because they're an important part of the daily provisioning of the city, because they're bringing lots of the stuff in that's being grown in. And so I think that I think Violani's sort of making those connections between that entire system that depends on the rest of the world as well as local growers.
So is the kind of cataloging then as a way to what I'm wondering is this a particular moment when there is sort of rapid transformation or a kind of transformation in Florence that demands a certain cataloging of the kind of changing environment?
No, but what is demanded, this has been written about extensively, is the methods developed to take account of your finances as a system of entrances and exits, they call them, or debts and credits, instead of just sort of a big pile of wealth that you have, right? The net worth as a fundamental concept is born of this double entry bookkeeping where you're keeping track of your debts and credits so that you can balance your checkbook at the end of the month. And that's the innovation. And it's that system of quantifying and listing and cataloging that gets translated into the way they see the world generally. That's what, so it's not necessary, but it's a way, that's a representational mode there. Yes, sir.
I have a related question. So is this a monolingual environment? I mean, if you're in Florence and you are eavesdropping in public, are you understanding everyone's language? And then to what extent do linguistic problems come into the travels of the three amigos, as you call them?
That's all right.
So, and because I'm thinking about your soundscape too, like there's the sense that you want to control and manipulate, but is it a monolingual environment? Did you understand everyone's language?
It's an excellent question, and I don't have a definitive answer, but I can't answer partially. Merchants tended to be monolingual, but they often had a remedial knowledge of Latin. They could read some, but not very much. They certainly couldn't write in it. So what they would, there was a culture of notaries who were well schooled in Latin, who were translating classical texts for the consumption of mercantile readers who didn't care about the poetry and style of the Latin or Greek, but just wanted the content. They wanted the stories and stuff. And so they're kind of monolingual, but elite merchants would have been able to understand other Italians, so Venetian dialect, Neapolitan dialect. That they would have been able to communicate. Beyond that, no. I mean, they have a system whereby their bureaucracy is being produced mainly in Latin. So no one can read that. And in fact, in the mid-14th century, the Florentine government translated its statutes into Italian specifically so that merchants could read the laws of their own city. So it is kind of. And I think when you go to Jerusalem, you have these Franciscans who are probably multilingual, who are doing all of the cultural mediation for you. That's the impression I get. It's not clear how they are talking sort of diplomatically. For example, when they talk about visiting the Sultan in Cairo, no one mentions what language they might be speaking in, but they're obviously interpreters. There's a 13th century Christian who goes to Iraq, and it's clear that he knew Arabic and Persian and Latin and Italian in writing and reading and speaking. So it's not completely uncommon, but generally, yeah, when you're listening in on gossip, yeah, it's all Italian, or in this case, Florentine. Yeah.
You've given some wonderful examples of ways that the residents of Florence found ways to measure and record the spatial dimensions. And it seems to me that this was preceding or corresponding in time with advances in technical aspects of painting, perspective, representation of landscapes, and so on. Can you comment about whether you perceive a relationship between this activity of quantifying the spatial dimensions and finding ways to communicate about it with some of the advances in art at the time?
Yeah, I mean, it's so tempting to want to explain, right, the cultural innovations of the Renaissance as a product of the techniques and the demands of this mercantile, like, very wealthy class, what they wanted to see, look at, own, and certainly they're producing a certain demand, right? And with their wealth. In terms of technologies, it's a much trickier cause and effect game to play. But I mean, so I've been speculating about the ways in which, okay, so a certain kind of pictorial realism might be more suited to a mercantile visual culture, because they're like in their reading practice, they don't like a lot of the very complex iconographic, rhetorical, and sort of tropes that both literature and painting has developed. And so that a much more naturalistic looking picture is just easier to consume. I wouldn't put that in print, but I'm sort of thinking about that, that it's not to say that these pictures are dumbed down, but the merchants can really get them in a particular way. They can see the world that they can appropriate. Because at the same time, so in Florence, and Nora has worked extensively on this, the importation of Ptolemy's geography as a way of representing the world that Florentines are the first to learn or relearn in Europe. Although you were telling me yesterday that Palermo, Sicily had it in the 13th century already, a copy of Ptolemy. But they're learning what we would come to call modern cartographic techniques. And they're learning through Ptolemy, and they are experimenting with different perspectival systems of visualization, which will ultimately lead to other forms of visual representation. And they are, the telescope, right, is astronomy, a little later on, is very much connected to Florentine science. And so there are various technologies of visualization at work. And I've made the case in a course that these are, that both merchants and intellectuals are participating in the same culture and are interested in all these things at the same time. Cause and effect, I'm not exactly sure. Yeah.
So I'm going to go back to earlier slide, which had all the lists that was available of all the stuff inside the city, all the students and all the things.
Oh, right, yeah.
It was a very suspicious list because all the numbers are very round numbers. If I remember correctly.
Yes, they are. Well, yeah, they are.
So,
thank you for pointing that out. Except for a couple, they are. Yeah.
Right, except for a couple, some of those are just not believable as a list like that.
Because of their quantity, or just because they're rounded off to
the exact rounding of them at 10,000 children, 1,200 boys, 600 students. I mean, those numbers must be estimates or boasts or something.
Or a combination of the two.
Right.
Yes, and this is something that I have not been able to figure out yet, but I'm constantly dealing with in terms of, okay, so they said they walked around the pyramids, in which case they probably are trying to measure relatively precisely because they're really fascinated by it. But as far as measuring other kinds of distances and sites, there's a lot of estimation. There must be estimation going on because that's what they're trained to do. Since he participated at the upper levels of government, he would have had access to tax records and documents, and so he may. So I think that there is a combination of maybe inflating numbers, certainly because this is a very patriotic text, right? Inflating numbers. Yeah, especially with it. Okay, you might not be able to. Say 500 nuns in 24 convents. Yeah, he's probably doing a very quick accounting of all of these various papers. Yeah, I mean that's a good point to make. I'm assuming though that he's somewhere near the relationship between these numbers is somewhere.
Right.
I mean, because this has been used by historians to show precisely the economic production and wealth of Florence. So a lot rests on these numbers.
There's the same problem in Roman tombstones, which have very precise dates. People have lived for 3 years, some of them 3 years, 2 months, 4 days, and 8 hours. So they do not know that.
Because there are no birth records that account for the time.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's with this? This is the other end. It's absolute specific numbers, and these are used in a whole variety of social history to figure out death rates and age of people at death and stuff like that. But what are these numbers? And they're very suspiciously accurate for that time. And these are sort of, to me, these numbers seem very suspiciously round.
Yes.
The one quick thing you said about the measuring, I've seen a lot of my archaeologist friends do this. They pace around monuments to get rough estimations of it, and they say it's very accurate. Like, it's not even worth for many of them getting any more accurate kind of measurements, because they roughly know I've seen them do it, so they're actually walking in a strange way, but they're carefully trying to keep their pace as even as possible, and
they know what their pace is about.
They know what about their pace is, and most of the times that's good enough for what they're doing to measure roughly that, and it's fairly accurate. As long as you know your pace, you can be fairly accurate at your distance.
No, that makes sense. And that's good, because it means that walking really is like a powerful tool.
Right.
Yeah.
So are you imagining that there probably was a conversion between Bracia and the
They probably
pace of the water?
had a sense of how many Bracia were in so many steps. And
Of their steps.
Of their steps,
Because, there's another source a little later, which he walks around a lake. He says it's 500 of my steps.
Right.
He doesn't do the translation into Bracia.
Right.
So I'm wondering if everyone knows, because depending on how big their gate is, I guess. Yeah.
You know, and I know that my Fitbit tells me how far I went based on my height.
Is that what, based on your height? Yeah.
Well, based on my height would then be rough estimation of my stride, and it'll give me a very rough, it's not perfect, but it's accurate enough for most purposes.
Right.
This is so fascinating to me. And I just can't resist asking about the intended audience for these, because you said these are diaries, right?
Yeah.
And there's something so very intimate, there's an intimate quality of what you're describing in terms of these merchants needing to find some means of navigating the city, and it sounds very personal. It sounds like this is for their own survival. I mean, you mentioned that it's illegal to badmouth the government of Florence at the time, so there's actual stakes here for both themselves and their families based on the advice that one of them is giving, right, to loved ones. And so I guess I'm just trying to square that, sort of this manual for how to conduct oneself and to survive in this urban space with what a counterpart component in these lists, which seems like braggadocio. Look how grand we are. It seems posited on the notion that this is not just going to be Dear Diary, that this is going to be, look how great we are, Genovese. Look, hey Venetians, you suck. In so many
Nothing changes.
I guess I'm just trying to square in my head, okay, if these are diaries, and if this is their way of making sense of their world, I get that this is a background and it's a very sort of personal version of understanding their space and navigating it. But then is there another component here where any of them attempted or thought in any way, shape, or form of publishing this, of circulating it to a wider audience? It just seems like all of this painstaking quantification, is this solely for their own, way of processing the world, or is there some design on a, grandiose testament? Or are they thinking of the diaries as potential, this I think taps into my own thinking about 19th century San Francisco, as documents for posterity?
Yeah, I think you are right in all cases. I think there's elements of that, depending on the genre. I mean, I should perhaps specify that there are kinds of generic differences, and they bleed into each other, so that if the account book stands, and it has been understood, the account book of your finances stands as the beginning of this type of literature, because merchants would begin between the lines of accounts, say, oh, and my daughter was born today at this hour, or such and such died today, or there was a lightning struck the bell tower and roof. So, and then that text begins to get bigger, and so you have a kind of a double hybrid genre, and then those accounts end up being their own separate kind of writing. And it's kind of a moment. It's a moment from the 13th into this. These genres die in the 16th century. They're pretty much because of the professionalization of history as an intellectual discipline, and the fact that these merchants are no longer participating directly in political culture, because they're on the sidelines, because there's now a duchy with a duke and hereditary royal family or noble family. And so these texts are part of their engagement politically with the city, because it's their duty to serve in government, and they feel it's also their duty to write about their city. So they're caught between their personal loyalty from what are called libri di familia, like family books, which are advice to, right, that are also at the same time boosters for their city as well as a kind of political critique. And sometimes they divide into things like scrapbooks, zibaldoni, where you take things like your favorite sermons, your favorite stories, and you repackage them in a kind of a scrapbook, or you write down things that happen as well, which are much more public, and those are connected to sort of repertories of stories of professional storytellers that will have these repertories. You'll write down your favorite narratives, city origins, and biblical stories, that kind of thing. And you'll change them around. That's the nice thing too. They'll take Dante and they'll change the story to make it suit their mercantile interests instead, give it a different ending, and so there are so there is definitely advice to a family, and we see some books where sons will take over the book and continue it, or just copy as a way of maintaining a family archive of who we are and who we used to be. And some are copied by others because they're so popular, and they actually are they become less and less about a particular family and much more about the city, and so they often get copied and circulated. And we have letters that people say, "Oh, don't lend my copy of this to that guy because he'll never return it." And so there's, this is the age before printing, so it's. And then you have Giovanni Villani is a chronicler. He's an unofficial chronicler. He's not professionally paid for this, but he takes it upon himself. See, I'm going to be the historian of my city because it means something to me. And merchants will often they'll say, I copied this by myself. It means I'm literate, and I took the time after hours to copy out some other person's scrapbook, for example.
Any other questions? And the rustling outside suggests that lunch is being set up, so that's good.